This is Cannaramic, and we're bringing you cannabis like you've never seen it before.
This is Cannaramic, and we are bringing you cannabis like you have never seen it before. I'm your host, Felicia Palmer, and today we are so excited to have David Holland, who has been fighting the fight and walking the walk and working diligently in the cannabis industry for such a long time. I'm going to let you tell most of your own story, but your background, of course, you're a litigation attorney. You have worked with some of the biggest brands in cannabis, including High Times, where you were their counsel for, I'd say, about 8 to 10 years, I think. And and now you're actually with Empire State Normal, which is the national organization for the reform of marijuana legislation. And that's one of the biggest, oldest, I wouldn't say, organizations for cannabis advocacy in the country. So welcome.
Well, thank you. This is a great opportunity. I really appreciate the chance to be part of such a historic event. I'm a very fortunate guy. I got into this in a long series of special events that came along that allowed me to become really the activist that I wanted to be in the area. I've been a criminal defense attorney for about 25 years, and during that time I met Michael Kennedy, who is one of the well-known, sadly passed on a few years back, but he was one of the great criminal defense attorneys around. And he, from the 1960s, had always taken the position that marijuana doesn't make you a criminal and it doesn't make you a bad person if you use it. And he had been really involved with a lot of Vietnam vets that were coming back that were suffering PTSD that wasn't diagnosed as such back then. But in a long story short, he ended up representing Tom Forcade, who's the founder of High Times magazine. And together they really decided that there ought to be some sort of outlet for people to talk about cannabis use. Mm-hmm. And in the early 70s, there was talk about, the government might try to eradicate cannabis altogether. So Tom Forcade decided, let's put together a magazine. And if you can't overthrow the government, then let's overgrow it to make sure that they can't get rid of it. So they taught the people how to grow. So that's what one of my inspirations was. I came to work with Michael, and I was of counsel to him for about 12 years.
That's exciting stuff. I mean, just being a part of that period of time, which was so wild west,
You got that right. Yeah. So from 2004 until his death, I was working with him on cannabis related matters and helping out High Times magazine as counsel to them. And during that time, we took on a lot of very cutting edge types of, whether we were defending people accused of being part of marijuana distributions or we've done group clemency action and petitioned President Obama to get 5 elderly people that were doing life without parole in prison. We successfully got 4 of their sentences commuted. So we really took on the establishment every way we could to make sure that cannabis was viewed as it is now. It's an amazing transformation since 2004 when I really took this on.
Well, I can definitely see. So on the road to where we are right now, you actually represented regular everyday people who were fighting for their lives in the system. Some people who had been in jail for elderly people who were in jail, people who had been accused. So it wasn't just on a corporate level, but really working with regular folks.
Absolutely. I mean, anybody from working the guy on the street corner up to the guy that, is alleged to have cornered the market in international drug distribution conspiracies. I had a chance to work with all of them. Wow. And the most important thing is we've won this battle. You are now seeing 33 states have now legalized marijuana in some form, either medically or for adult use. That was unheard of when I came into the game in way back when I started being an attorney. So to watch the progress of this has just been an amazing event. And to even have a talk show like this to be part of, nobody would have touched it way back when. They would have thought you were crazy. So you are doing a great service to everybody by finally making well heard the voices of the cannabis movement and the cannabis future.
Well, you're passing the baton to us, and we're, you did that hard work down the road, and we're going to continue the work. So those cases that you worked, were there any key cases that really pushed the needle forward?
Well, there are a lot of cases that pushed. Some I was involved in, some that I was the beneficiary of what happened. But if you start with the official federal criminalization comes under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. In 1974, NORML, the organization I'm part of, National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, challenged the DEA in 1974 on whether it should be a Schedule I drug. And just so you know, a Schedule I drug has 3 criteria: that it has no medical value, that it can't be controlled, and that it has a high degree of abuse and addiction potential. And that was the 3 bases by which it was put into Schedule I, which I'll tell you about later. But so Normal challenged that, and the administrative law judge named Judge Young said that it doesn't belong here. It doesn't meet those 3 criteria. It should be something other than this, but it should not be so heavily penalized. And there's a historic story behind how it got there, which it was Nixon really used it as a weapon against both the counterculture and also Black activism.
Wow.
And
Wow.
There's a very famous quote that goes along with that demonstrates that.
Well, you know what? I can't wait to talk about that because that's a huge piece. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Schedule I status of the drug.
Sure.
So we all know that cannabis has medicinal value. I mean, there are studies out of Israel, Germany, all of these other countries that had not banned the study of cannabis that show the medicinal value for people with all type of chronic illnesses, for inflammation, actually fighting cancer, etc. How is it that still this drug, this plant was allowed to be on this on the Schedule I, which basically puts it on the same level as something like heroin and MDMA, correct?
It does, and it's irrational that it was ever placed there. It was never meant to stay there, and yet it's been. The bottom line is it's really politics, and there's really racism and other issues at play, which put it on Schedule I status to begin with.
Wow.
And let me just go back to some of the key cases that have tried to challenge that. There's a very famous case of called Gonzalez v. Raich that came out of the West, where it was somebody was just growing for their own consumption, and the reach of Congress was found to even touch that, even if you were never going to sell it and just smoke it for yourself. So these are some rulings that I wasn't involved in that case, but I've used the ruling in that case to try to challenge it elsewhere. One case I was involved with was Cannaramic. It's a U.S. versus Cannaramic, where I was stating back in 2009, and since that day that even has come out to play in Attorney General Barr's confirmation hearings, that the federal government is really deferring to the states, saying there are 33 states that now have medical marijuana. And of the 3 criteria I told you about for Schedule I, one is that it doesn't have any medical value. So the majority, 2/3 of your states have already said, this is a medicine. And the federal government is really actively throwing up its hands and saying, well, you just go on and do your business. As long as it doesn't interfere with, other objectives of law enforcement like money laundering, organized crime, things like that. These are the Cole memoranda, the second Cole memoranda that came out in 2013. The federal government said, well, we won't touch it. And what's really important is that not only did that become the guidance for the Attorney General's office under Eric Holder, who was with Obama, and Attorney General Sessions inherited that, and he said, well, I'm removing any restrictions on my U.S. attorneys. They can do what they want in their territories, but it's been pretty well abided. But there was a case called McIntosh that came out a couple of years back, which said in there was what's called the Rohrabacher-Farr or the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer amendment to a spending provision that said, as an act of Congress, that federal agencies cannot use federal funds to go out and prosecute medical providers and medical patients who are in compliance with the state law where they're getting their marijuana.
Right.
So you can't find a more active federal stance to want to avoid enforcing its own law.
Right.
That creates a real conflict between federal law and state law. And it's one that I've been harping on for about 10 years now, and Attorney General Barr, during his confirmation hearings, also said the same thing. It just can't be allowed to stay the way it is.
Right.
But he made it very clear that he didn't think it was fair to go after all the organizations that had built themselves around the federal assurances and state assurances that they could do this without fear of being prosecuted. So it's a very interesting place. So these are all important events and cases that have come along.
So here we are at a place where you said 33 states have some sort of program, medical or adult use. And then you have other states that have nothing. So those people have no access whatsoever. And then you have a federal government that's taking I'm not going to touch position. I'm not going to take a position, but I'm not going to bother you. But we may not. They're just kind of in limbo right now.
Right.
What is this creating? What type of environment is this creating for people who are looking to do business, or for the economy that's looking to emerge from this, for people who are looking for medicinal benefits? How does this impact regular people?
Well, it's complicated landscape because the federal government is doing everything it can in many ways to tie its own hands without changing its own laws. Mm-hmm. So it's two contradictory messages, which is go ahead and do it and do it as your state says you can. But we're not going to tell you we're not going to come after you someday just because we have the right. And I have been developing another litigation, which I plan to launch in the near future, that there is a point where the federal government can no longer say, we can enforce, but we won't. I think that there's an argument to say once you let so much time elapse, which is since California in 1996 went medical, you've had 23 years and they've never done anything about it. And 32 other states have followed suit, and the District of Columbia, where Congress sits. At what point can you say you no longer have the right to enforce that? And that's a theory I've been working on. There are some very specific Supreme Court cases that will support that theory, I believe.
So it's sort of like a statute of limitations that they would have had to take some action to state that they were not going to, or they were going to do something in this regard. And because they did nothing, they've kind of run out of time to do.
That's right. It's called estoppel, which is sort of, in fairness, you no longer can assert that right because you've been refusing and to do it for so long, and really actively refusing to do it for so long. So it's a political question now. I think it goes past the constitutional challenges, though myself and others will continue to bring them. I think that the Attorney General has really said, I'm not going to do anything else, but it's on Congress to really change the law because it cannot sit this way any further.
Yeah, one of the things I think about is this kind of limbo, right? That's created this environment, especially when I look at businesses who are looking to create viable businesses in cannabis, the financial aspect, the FDIC, people can't get funding for their cannabis businesses. So the only people who are thriving, the only companies that are thriving are those that are self-funded, those that, represented by venture capitalists, which is locking out a whole constituency of people who, if you can't go to the bank and say, I'd like to get a loan to be a part of this industry. And those type of people, the lower level, I guess, business owners, the smaller business owners, those are the ones that probably would have a large connection to the communities that were impacted, right? So, the woman who, or the young man who actually may have been involved in illegal marijuana at one point in his life has, good credit, wants to go to the bank and get a loan. He can't get a loan because there's no financing because of the federal government's, not making a position here. There's no financing for this industry. So that's an example of the limbo and the impact, right?
Absolutely. And this is, so you hear a lot about social equity programs, that people really want to see that as their states roll out some sort of legalization, that there's social equity that allows those very people that have been prosecuted and really persecuted in their neighborhoods for cannabis are allowed to get a chance to get into the marketplace like anybody else. And it's trying to create a fairer footing for everybody to get there, because it's exactly that. Without bank lending, you're stuck with venture capital. But the people that are close to the communities that might see an opportunity to build a business around it, once you've suffered even a misdemeanor conviction, your credit is shot. So nobody's going to take a chance on you. So you're a high risk, which means your community also becomes, if you do it by concentration of people that may have been arrested, and with 87% of all the arrests being Black and Latinx community members, it's an insane criminalization of the whole social system, if you will.
Right.
That it allows, without banking, sheer monopolies of the venture capitalists to come in and seize the opportunity. And that's just not fair. That's not right. And, so there should be community reinvestment programs, which we're working on here in New York and in other states, to try to allow those communities to also get a footing into the business, to be able to create licenses so they could either, manufacture it, cultivate it, distribute it, and so forth. Because that's what's fair, is let everybody into the marketplace.
Right.
And not just a select few.
So just a quick understanding in terms of, for instance, marijuana arrests in the United States, and if we can talk specifically about New York, and under stop and frisk, what percentage of those arrests were for marijuana-related, altercations where people were holding a small amount of marijuana or any amount of marijuana versus other types of drug or substances?
Well, it was a high number. I don't have the statistic specifically, and there are two different things. Stop and frisk was, I don't know any other way to explain it, just a sheer form of thuggery, if you will. It was just police decided to go into neighborhoods they thought were at risk, and they tended to be minority-based communities, and would just throw people up against the side of a building, question them, go through their pockets, ask them what's going on. It was a horrible, horrible program that got put into place. What marijuana arrests allowed often was be able to get somebody and put them into a vulnerable spot and try to get them to talk about where'd you get it from and who are the bigger players out there. And so it was a little bit more directed at trying to get into, these, what they thought were big distribution networks, which is just usually some guy on a street corner.
Right.
But the numbers were staggering. I think it was in this, my best recollection is from 2004 to 2013 was 800,000 marijuana arrests in New York City, 87% of which were members of minority communities.
Wow. So you see, so the disproportionate, not even disproportionate, that is like bombshell impact on these communities. When we talk about how the arrest, what the ripple effect, as someone else would say, of the arrest is. Not only on the person who's arrested, but on his family and indirectly his community. And this type of thing has been happening, if we go back in time in history. The actual racism or propaganda that actually caused this. Let's talk a little bit about how these communities are still the ones that are being affected by marijuana legalization, prohibition.
Absolutely, and I don't mean to be long-winded, but I got to give you a little bit of a history of how we ever got here and then what Nixon really did to solidify the true racist and oppressive nature of the law that he wanted to put in place. So marijuana makes its way into the United States in the early 1900s. It comes from Mexico, and it's really moving with the Mexican Civil War has ended, and they're now coming into the United States. You also are seeing members, former slaves, former sharecroppers making their way from the south towards the north. These two groups, as is the migrant experience, find themselves with job opportunities along the way, and usually in larger urban centers. And all of a sudden, there is this is a plant that can be grown to some extent by themselves, be served. So you're not partaking in the liquor system. You're not partaking in other types of commercially produced things. That later will have a little bit of effect, but in flashing forward from the early 1900s, 1929, we all know there was the big stock market crash. Mm-hmm. And with that, people went broke. And in doing that, large agribusiness came into play, right? Banks went out and they started to seize these large farms and could hold tracts of them, get thousands and thousands of acres at a time, and timberland. And so then comes along FDR, puts together his New Deal. And if you remember, he ended up creating farm subsidies to try to keep the farmers on their land and keep the markets from crashing further. So all of a sudden you had subsidies for corn, cotton, wheat, tobacco, sugar, and timber. Mm. 5 major products or commodities of the United States that this single marijuana plant that's fairly harmless, they cannot kill you, cannot do anything, but for centuries, which has made rope, which has made clothing, which has made paper. All of those are products that are made from those now 5 farm subsidies. So there is an active conspiracy, if you will, to lobby against allowing marijuana to be legal anymore. And so that is, the big money players want to take out the small farmers who can create a product that means that they won't, be smoking their tobacco, and they won't be drinking their liquor, and they'll be making their own clothing and textiles.
Right.
So that comes around, but just to make sure that society caught on and to play upon its terrible racist inclinations, the word marijuana is the Mexican word, it's a slang word. The plant is a cannabis plant. But they decided all of a sudden in the 1930s, you see Harry Ainslinger, and he becomes really the first federal drug czar. And Ainslinger decides to play on American paranoia to seize the power. And so he calls it marijuana and starts tying it into the Mexicans. And it's the Mexicans and the blacks that are associated with it. And he says something to the effect to really start to drive the point home. Marijuana is what makes black men think they are white and white women want to sleep with them.
Wow.
So he starts to really play into this horrific racist element of these migratory communities that are finding their way into the American landscape. And that's where you start to see the reefer madness and that famous propaganda movie of 1936, where, you know, it's if you smoke marijuana, you'll become a murderer and you'll become insane and everything else. So that is the start of really the criminalization of marijuana, but it's the demonization of the cannabis plant, you know,
right.
Because it had been, just so you know, in the 1800s. And if you go to some antique shops, you'll see marijuana, or it says cannabis tincture. You know, it was an oil. It was something people put under their tongue to feel better. It was a pain reliever. It was all those things that, you know, were the tonics that you see in the old time movies. And it was well known. It was sold in barbershops and everything else. So now you have people that are earning a lot of money through farm subsidies and gaining on the land and the crops that the federal government wants them to grow. Don't want this competitor out there. And this continues on now from the 1930s to 1970s.
Now, let me stop you really quick because I really want to kind of understand those who were growing the cannabis, marijuana. Were they predominantly the Mexican, African-American communities that were doing that?
I'm not saying that per se, because I'm not sure I can answer that wholeheartedly. It's certainly a drug that, or a plant that finds its way into the U.S. through the seeds that are being brought through what's typically associated with the Mexican migrant movement.
Right.
And it's the mixture of the various migrant populations, of which you have still an enormous migration of the former slave community. And they meet themselves together, as is the immigrants' experience in cities. They usually are the people that start out at the lowest end of the spectrum and build their communities and work their way up.
So the idea here was to associate this plant with these communities in order to demonize. Well, they already had demonized these communities, and the way to now bring that association with this plant to help to bolster those companies and those organizations that needed to have the monopoly, and basically say, well, you know, this particular plant is associated with this negativity, this connotation, and that's how they were able to get the public to support the criminalization or the demonization of cannabis. Absolutely.
And it's not only that, it's really to basically say, it's not just this plant, don't let this community of immigrants and this community of former slaves, these people of color, make it. Don't give them an industry. Don't give them an opportunity. Don't let them be able to do as other people have done and build farmlands that become a means to wealth. So, and just let me fast forward you, because this is an important quote. So in 1970, Congress passes the Controlled Substances Act. And that's where marijuana ends up on Schedule I, which we were talking about. And it was only supposed to be there temporarily until they figured it out. But Nixon was facing, at this time, you had the hippies were speaking out against the Vietnam War, and you had the Black Power movement, which was a very powerful and necessary social movement. And he was absolutely determined to put those movements down. So I'm going to read you a quote from John Ehrlichman, who was one of his advisors in the White House. And this is what he said about the Schedule I status of marijuana. So let me just say to you, and this is a quote: "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So that shows you that this whole demonization of cannabis had nothing to do with the properties of the plant. It had everything to do with who they could associate with it. And it has been a sad tragedy as to we still, nearly 50 years later, are still looking at the same thing. Communities of color have basically been ravaged by over-enforcement, persecuting rather than prosecuted for cannabis assumptions that they have cannabis in the communities, and they're arrested at 87% of the time.
Wow.
It's a horrible crime that we've committed against society, and that's what the social equity movement is about, is trying to correct that, and particularly important is trying to expunge people's records, which is not allowed in New York State, but that means that you basically remove it as if there would never a conviction before. That would allow people to regain their credit, regain their opportunity, regain their ability with landlords to say, I'll be a good tenant. All of these things, the ripple effect of a conviction, even an arrest, is just horrible. And if you're a person of color, you are going to experience it exponentially worse than somebody else who's not.
Right. So we have this illegitimate campaign that started many, many years, over 50 years ago, to basically create a ideology about cannabis by renaming it into a slang word associated with Latinos, Latinx community, and then also using it to enforce and devastate African American and Latin communities to this day. And I think about that when I think about, for instance, folks in my church who I've said to them, listen, there's a lot of benefit to medical marijuana for your lupus, for your pain that you're experiencing. Why don't you look into that? And they'll say to me, this woman said to me, I don't mess with that. I mean, that's the impact, right? So it's the psychological impact that we already still have. To some extent, it's a PTSD.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and it's not only that, people are afraid what would be the consequences, but remember there was this famous line from the DEA and FDA saying, oh, marijuana is a gateway drug. If you try that, you'll end up doing harder drugs. And the one thing that they have both admitted now, the FDA and the DEA, and they've removed that statement from their website because there's absolutely no statistical scientific basis to ever have said that. But one of the biggest problems that we have now is the opioid crisis. Everybody's addicted to painkillers, and marijuana has now proven itself as being an effective gateway off of opioid addiction.
Right.
So we really need legalization, and not just at the medical level, because that makes it very expensive and hard to obtain. Opioid addicts exist everywhere. We see them every day now, and it's a scourge that legal medicine was allowed to make addicts in a way that marijuana was alleged to be doing and had no harmful effects like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that, just thinking about that, I mean, I think you put it so clearly, like pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical industry essentially created this crisis because they know that the opioids are highly addictive. And they know that there's a potential for people to overuse them, and they're still allowed to put these out. But meanwhile, you have something like cannabis that actually has never been proven to be a gateway or to cause addictions of that level in people. And there's nothing, they don't do anything about the pharmaceuticals, but they're attacking cannabis. Where do you see? You talk about legalization, because I think that we do have legalization, like you said, in 33 states, but the federal level, we don't. So therefore, people can't even get coverage for medical marijuana in their insurance plans. So even these communities, even if you got to the point you were educated enough to seek a medical marijuana card, you cannot get it covered and reimbursed by your insurance. So federal legalization needs to happen.
I think that's right. And you've really pinpointed one of the biggest problems is insurance companies are not your friends. They want to collect premiums and not pay. So they don't necessarily want legalization. But the federal government needs to, and so their position is, look, I can't insure something that the federal government says is illegal.
Right.
And I can't get Medicaid or Medicare to pay for it and so forth. But with this, and I think that we're now talking something that's going to be a very hot topic coming up with the next presidential election in 2020, every candidate's talking about this, but with federal legalization, it should allow all the states to decide how they want to have, whether they want to have medical, whether they want to have adult use, if they want nothing. And that's what this nation is supposed to be, is a nation of states who determine these things, not the federal government.
Right.
I just want to go back to the opioid crisis to just point out just how insidious this is. We were watching, there are lawsuits against the Purdue manufacturers, who are the people that created OxyContin. And the records are pretty much showing that they knew from day one this was super addictive, but they wanted doctors to go out there to sell it. And if you look at these lawsuits, the companies that manufactured are being charged money. It's just a money game. Okay, they'll pay some fines, but the doctors who prescribed it are the ones going to go to jail.
Wow.
And the people that have now been addicted are going to be left with nothing. So there's no safety net for the victims of the very crimes that the United States Federal Drug Administration, the Food and Drug Administration, has allowed to grow to the point of creating this national epidemic. It is hard. And so cannabis never did that.
Right.
So the unfairness, and when people of color really say, we feel we've been oppressed, all they got to do is look at what happened to the people that ran the organizations that are not people of color, that were, had the government approve what they did, and they'll never pay the penalty that a cannabis user.
Wow. Wow.
So sad.
So the pharmaceutical companies are basically being allowed to get away with creating this. And actually now they've got their eye on looking at testing cannabis and seeing if they can now patent some sort of medicine for the purposes of getting into the cannabis space. So now here they are again at the door. Right. Looking for an in. What do you see as what the legalization model would look like on the federal government? So we have the federal government that says one day by legislative vote that we're going to have legalization. How does that work when 33 states already have programs and there are states that don't have programs? How does that look?
Well, I think that it's a great question. I'm not sure I'm the smartest guy in the room to answer it, but I think that it's this, that the federal government will say, we want to remove it from any schedule. And just so you understand that, the Controlled Substances Act took every prescribable drug out there, and even things like aspirin, and they put them in a schedule 1 to 5, 5 being basically over-the-counter products and 1 being marijuana, PCP, heroin, the worst of the worst. If they reschedule it, that doesn't mean anything. You'd still need a doctor's prescription, and that doesn't seem to be where we're at anymore. So if they deschedule it and say, we don't want to have to regulate it in any way, I don't think that you'll see a federal program. I think what they'll do is say to the states, you all decide amongst yourselves whether you want to have it and how you want to administer it. And this would make the states, not only is that their constitutional right under the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution, but it creates, as that famous statement, the states are supposed to be the laboratories of democracy. It would allow the states to make decisions, and I think they should, because the interests of South Dakota may not be the same as North Dakota. Absolutely. It may not be the same as California or Montana. And each of them has taken different approaches to this.
So would that scenario also allow for the banking industry to get involved? So once they've taken it off any schedule, the banking industry on a federal level would be able to get involved, and it would open up all those other pieces, but at the same time give the states the rights to manage how they're going to handle their programs.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, once you remove the federal penalties for getting involved in the cannabis industry, money laundering and engaging in a drug trafficking enterprise, which is what the banks always fear, is what's going to be said about them taking the monies, then the banks will feel a lot freer, and then you'll be able to get out of the risks of having an all cash society. People will be able to use their debit cards like most people do now. Cash is sort of a thing of the past, but you'll be able to get taxes paid. You'll be able to, these businesses actually want to be fully functioning businesses like any other, so they can pay their taxes and keep their lights on and not have to worry about having tons of cash on hand, which is just dangerous, So I think that with federal descheduling, which is what I think we'll see happen in the next 18 months, then the states will be in a much better position to regulate what these economies will look like and And, then you'll start to see people travel in interstate commerce. So you can take this on an airplane. You can buy some in Colorado and take it to Kansas. It's going to be an interesting, there will be battles along the way, but that once the federal government steps out altogether, which it's trying to do without giving in on just descheduling, it will correct itself, and we'll see lots of opportunity for lots of people, and hopefully lots of opportunity for the communities most affected by the drug war.
Absolutely. So it really is, you're saying 18 months. I mean, that is like super right around the corner. I can't even believe you're here talking about this, having been where you've been, to be saying 18 months from now, it could be federally, decriminalized and taken off of the schedules. I mean, that's an amazing feat. Well,
if you look at your candidates, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but if you really look at them, you got Hickenlooper, who's the former governor of Colorado, was the first state to legalize. You have Kamala Harris, who's coming in from California, and while she was a drug war, crusader, so to speak, when she was a prosecutor, she's certainly taken the position that California is now legal, and so it's an issue she has to address. Bernie Sanders, Vermont has already ended up becoming a legalized state, but you can't sell it commercially. You can grow it and give it away to each other, but you can't sell it. So Trump, who is a states' rights guy, has, I think, silently said it's fine by him if the states choose how it wants to go. And you have Andrew Cuomo from New York, who's now really changed his tune and all of a sudden tried to pass legalization here. So you don't have one presidential candidate out there other than Joe Biden, who had been a very strong drug war guy who was against cannabis and against the communities who are doing it, who perpetuated some of these things. But all of them now are people talking about cannabis. So the chances of it not becoming legal, I think, are very slim.
That is, I mean, you just heard what you said. All of these presidential candidates are talking about cannabis. This never gets high up enough in the conversation. It just has never gotten this hard, besides in a negative stance when Nixon demonized it. I mean, has it ever truly been this high in the conversation?
Not as far as I've ever, I remember it was Clinton who said, I smoked but didn't inhale. That was about as close to got. And Obama said, yes, I did when I was younger, but he regretted it, later. Right. So admissions of use got us nowhere. Now we're having admissions that maybe there's a viable business opportunity out there. And it's not, it's not that if you can't beat them, join them, but there are reasons to believe that this is medically a great product, that the uses of, let's just say, the stems and the stalks of the plant that don't get smoked can be used to make paper, which, won't take away the trees, which means there's less greenhouse gas effects, which means we have a cleaner environment. The domino effect, the ripple effect of allowing cannabis to go is going to have so much greater benefit than the costs of trying to continue to pretend that it has negative. So, that's billions and trillions of dollars that have been wasted that we might have spent in better, management of a legalized economy.
Right. So what do everyday people do at this point? I mean, 18 months is coming down the pike, and it's going to happen whether or not your pastor wants it to happen, whether grandmama feels it should happen, it's going to happen. So how do our communities get engaged in this so that we can at least understand it, how it impacts us, and what we should be doing to be a part of it?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, I think right now, people, as they have been, activist groups getting together saying, what do they want to happen in their community? And there are communities that don't want it, and I respect that. But the communities that do want it, what do you want that to look like? Are there particular areas of town that you want them in or don't want them near schools or churches? How do you want to, try to create community investment where there's local lending? Saying these are high risk, but let's have lending and get all that in place. Oh my gosh, I mean, it's going to come faster than anybody thought. And what's happened to a lot of states is they get caught, a little bit with their pants down because they just weren't ready for how popular this really will become. And so it's that, really, who do you talk to? Your town officials, talk to the zoning and planning communities. How can we get ready for this if we want to have it? And that's the best thing you can do, because the rest will fall into place very quickly. And get educated. Seek out places like Normal. Normal is more than happy to try to give you all the information we can about what it means to have a legalized environment and who are your representatives that you should talk to. That's what we do.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of work to be done. You have certainly paved the path along with all of your colleagues over the years. Your work has only led us to where we are right now. And we're excited that you could see it, that you can be a part of it as it's happening. And we're excited to take the energy now and take it to the next level and see where this will go and make sure that it's done with integrity. We don't want to have another, cigarette, tobacco monopoly or anything of that nature. We have to be very, very involved and continue to be active to make sure that things are done the way they should be done.
And those are things you can do today. And I thank you for this opportunity and your very kind compliments. And if it weren't for people like you spreading the word, we wouldn't be getting very far. So we owe a lot to you all as media outlets to be able to say what you can do today and where we're headed. And it's a good place.
All right. Well, together we win. Let's go.
Yeah.